Around the world, many governments have been propping up their economies with stimulus packages to tackle the devastating effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. America alone has spent trillions of dollars. It could be about to spend trillions more.
Negotiations will continue today on a second round of stimulus money and unemployment benefits from the federal government.
The long-term impact of these unprecedented fiscal measures remains to be seen. You submitted your questions about America's stimulus to John Fassman, our Washington correspondent, and Callum Williams, our senior economics writer. Here are their answers. Where does the stimulus money come from?
I mean, fundamentally, it comes from the US government going out into the markets and borrowing money. So at the moment, the US government is taking in much less in taxes than it wishes to spend and is spending. And so basically it has to go to investors and say, we would like to borrow some money off you and we will pay you for that privilege. And fortunately, the conditions are such that the US government is able to borrow really, really vast amounts, trillions of dollars, and that's not going to cost them all that much given that interest rates are fairly low.
Callum, given that the American economy is in such a state, why is it still so easy for the government to borrow?
I think broadly speaking, the answer is to do with the fact that there's really high demand at the moment, and has been for a while, for kind of safe assets. And really the safest asset in the whole world is US government debt.
Will the funds actually reach the people who need it most?
You'll remember when the first round of federal unemployment stimulus came out, it took a while for that money to reach people because state unemployment systems are so creaky that they had to effectively redesign them to take in this new stream of funds. The worry about Trump's executive order on UI now is that with $300 coming from the federal government and $100 coming from the states, it's another new pair of income streams, which means the states will need to configure their systems to get that money to people, which means it will take some time to actually get the money to the people who need it most.
But John, I guess also it's the case, right, that there are large sort of chunks of people in the US who maybe were not even eligible for, say, the stimulus checks, which were paid out in April, and maybe even still haven't got their unemployment benefits, perhaps because they have an irregular immigration status and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's true. There is a risk that some people who need the money may not be able to get it at all. And remember that the amount of money that Trump made available through his executive order is just $44 billion. So that will last maybe 6 weeks. So whether people will get their money within 6 weeks is an open question. And then after that, the money goes away. So I think we'll probably see another sort of pinch later this fall.
How does the American economic stimulus compare to other countries globally?
I mean, there are a few other countries like Britain, Japan, Singapore, which get quite close. But America is pretty certainly the most generous of the whole world.
And that's, I think, particularly extraordinary given how stingy the American welfare state generally is and how deep the reluctance is to give people money when they're out of work.
In the US, for complicated historical reasons, every time there's a recession, there have to be these very prolonged negotiations at Congress about exactly how the US government is going to make unemployment insurance more generous. So the US kind of has to be more generous when it comes to a recession.
And this is part of the debate that's in Congress right now, right? Senators like Michael Bennet want the UI benefits to have stabilizers, meaning that until unemployment, one proposal is until the unemployment rate is back at pre-pandemic levels, some stimulus will keep going out. It will gradually be tapered down. So there's a move among some Democrats in particular in Congress to push the next stimulus measure, whenever that is, to include these stabilizers so it does go out automatically.
Has the increased unemployment benefit disincentivized people from going back to work?
No, it hasn't. There is not much work for people to go back to. So people are getting this money not as an alternative to actually finding work, but because so many businesses have closed, because so many businesses are hurting, because demand is down so much, this money is going out to make sure the entire economy doesn't seize up and people still have money to pay for food, rent, and things like that.
I mean, I think it is true that like there are many instances in which generous unemployment insurance payments can make it less likely that people look for work. It's not like a myth that happens, but at the moment, as John says, there's just absolutely no evidence that it's discouraging people from working.
There is this sort of doctrinal reluctance, especially among the American right, to giving people money, to giving people generous amounts of money who are out of work. because it does, in fact, it can disincentivize work. But in this case, that's just not true. There's no work for people to go to.
How will America's economic stimulus impact inflation?
So you hear this argument a lot from certain people that because the US is pumping so much money into the economy and the supply of money is rising quickly, that inflation is definitely going to be around the corner. My sense is that is not, at the moment, doesn't look very likely at all. And the reason for that basically is that what you're seeing at the moment is a lot of very cautious behavior, both among firms and among households. So, for instance, with households, the share of income that people are saving has gone way, way up since the pandemic began. And you're seeing the same thing with businesses, where businesses aren't investing really as much, anywhere near as much as they were. They're conserving the money instead. So although money's being paid out, it's not so clear that there's a lot of extra money kind of chasing goods and services, which ultimately is what causes inflation to go up. Wages just aren't really going to be going up that much. And fundamentally, to have inflation, persistent high inflation, you need to have wages that are also going up. Otherwise, inflation basically sort of runs out of steam. So at the moment, I just don't see that, the stimulus having a particularly large impact on inflation.
Should Americans be concerned that the stimulus will put the government in debt?
My sense is that it's okay and legitimate to worry about debt sustainability. There is obviously a point at which a country is overly indebted. I don't think the US is at that stage yet, not least because interest rates are very low. So the share of, federal money that's going on interest repayments is quite low by historical standards. But also, I think you have to make a judgment call as to whether having a bit of extra or quite a lot of extra debt is worse than a recession, which without the government help would have been really quite staggeringly bad. So I think it's the lesser of two evils, really.
But that doesn't mean that debt has no political salience. I think especially if you see Joe Biden win the White House, I think there's going to be a tremendous concern about national debt that comes from Republicans who have heretofore been quiet, both regarding the effects of Donald Trump's tax cut and the amount of money going out the door in the stimulus. Politically, I expect concern over the debt is going to rise quite steeply if Joe Biden wins.
So, John, does that mean that if Biden wins, that basically, unless the Democrats take both houses of Congress, you could basically rule out any further fiscal stimulus?
I would think so. I think unless Democrats take both houses of Congress, then I think you'll see a tremendous push for austerity.
Does that mean that purely from an economic perspective, you want Trump to win?
That is a fantastic question. Because if Trump wins, I think Democrats and Republicans alike, Democrats want to get money out the door generally. Republicans will be more willing with Trump in the White House. If you have Democratic control of both houses of Congress and the White House, I think you'll see stimulus continue. But debt will be the issue on which Republicans go charging into the midterms.
Can the positive effects of the stimulus on the US economy be shown?
If you look at what's happened to household income in the US since the crisis began, normally in a recession it goes down, kind of obviously, because people lose jobs and all that sort of stuff. Whereas so far this year it has gone up, which is highly unusual. So in that very sort of simplistic sense, it has had a positive impact on the economy. It's quite hard to point to any obvious negative effects that it's had. So on balance, I think it's a pretty compelling case. It's done a lot of good.
I think one other positive effect of the stimulus rate can be seen in the stabilization of poverty rates. That even as the economy contracted and people lost their jobs, the poverty rate did not measurably increase. That suggests to me that the stimulus kept people from falling into poverty who otherwise would have.
Is America becoming more socialist by handing out the stimulus?
No, I mean, the workers have not controlled the means of production. It's still a country of private businesses. Most Americans are capitalists to their bones. There's that great John Steinbeck quote that every poor person in America is a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. I think that still holds true. In this case, though, there are a whole lot of people who went out of work for no fault of their own and who need a lot of help, and the economy in general benefits from them getting that help. So Is that a socialist idea? If it's a socialist idea, I guess it is. But I don't think America is in any danger of becoming a socialist country.
Is it possible that there is, because the government was able to come together and basically spend a lot of money very quickly, and also spending money on things that I think in normal times would have seemed completely outrageous, like giving people more in unemployment than they got from their job. Is it possible that in the future it sort of opens the door towards more radical ideas being entertained?
I mean, there are clearly radical ideas being entertained that would not have been entertained 5 years ago. Things like a universal basic income, Medicare for all. Those have not come about because of the pandemic. They came about because of the conditions that sort of prevented a strong national response to the pandemic. So I think there is a groundswell for those sorts of broad, get money out the door ideas that would have been considered far too left to even contemplate 5 or 10 years ago. There is support for those, but that's distinct, I think, from the response to the pandemic. I think the response to the pandemic is so sui generis that it's hard to see it laying the groundwork for future sort of similarly radical ideas, just because the space for that, the conditions for that would have to be met. I think that the sort of shift leftward occurred for reasons unrelated to the pandemic and will keep occurring for reasons unrelated to the pandemic. I'm John Fassman, the Economist Washington correspondent. You can stay up to date with the issues surrounding the pandemic and politics in America by subscribing to our Checks and Balance newsletter. Just click on the link opposite. Thank you for watching.